Inside Greystone Prison, innocence didn't mean anything. The walls didn't care if a man had been framed. The guards didn't ask questions. The only law that mattered was survival, and that belonged to the ones willing to kill for it. They all knew he wouldn't last. A lone man, no crew, no allies, walking through a prison run by the very cartel that had put him here. A prison sentence wasn't enough. Someone powerful wanted him buried before the truth could surface, so they sent their enforcers one by one to finish what they had started. At first, they expected him to go down easy, like any other outsider marked for death, but Greystone Prison had a way of revealing what a man was made of. They didn't know the battles he had fought before this. They didn't know that every attack, every ambush, every blade in the dark only made him more dangerous. He wasn't just another victim waiting for his fate. He was a storm rolling in, slow and inevitable. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. Tyrone Boone had stopped counting the days. Time inside the prison wasn't measured in hours, weeks, or months. It was measured in fights. It was measured in the number of times he had to break someone's nose, crush a windpipe, or drive a shank into the gut of a man who came at him in the dark. It was measured in attempts on his life, in the careful, deliberate steps he took to ensure he wasn't caught off guard, in the way he slept with his back to the wall and one eye open. And it was measured in how much longer the cartel was willing to wait before they sent someone who could actually kill him. The latest attempt had been in the yard, a broad-shouldered thug with a jagged blade and dead eyes lunging at him from behind a group of weightlifters. Boone had moved before his mind even processed the attack, his body acting on reflex, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting until the blade clattered to the concrete. A quick, brutal knee to the stomach sent the attacker stumbling, gasping for air. Boone didn't hesitate. He grabbed the man's head, slammed it forward onto his knee, and felt the cartilage of his nose give way with a wet crunch. The man crumpled to the ground, motionless, bleeding, and humiliated. Boone straightened, scanning the yard. The cartel enforcers were watching. They weren't even subtle about it anymore. They leaned against fences, sat on benches, waiting for their turn, waiting for an opportunity. Boone had already taken down 5 men in a month. They were getting bolder, and so was he. A sharp whistle cut through the air, and the guards moved in, not to break up the fight, but to see if Boone had finally lost. They weren't here to protect him. If anything, they were disappointed to see him still standing. One guard sneered. "You got a lot of people real mad at you, Boone." Boone didn't answer. He wiped the blood from his knuckles and turned away, his body coiled like a spring, his mind already planning his next move. He couldn't keep fighting alone. If he wanted to make it out of here alive, he had to stop playing defense. It was time to start his own war. The walls of Greystone Maximum Security Prison weren't just meant to keep people in. They were meant to break men down, to strip them of everything they had been and grind them into dust. The air was thick with sweat, rot, and desperation. The kind of place where even the strong had to sleep with one eye open. Tyrone Boone sat on a cold bench in the yard, his elbows resting on his knees, his breathing steady despite the dull ache in his ribs from the last fight. He had learned to ignore pain a long time ago. It was just another part of the routine now. He didn't belong here. Most men in this place had spent their whole lives in the system, either trapped in it or running from it. But Boone had spent his life fighting for his country, for the men at his side, for the people who couldn't fight for themselves. He had done things most would never understand, some things he wasn't proud of, but never for the wrong reasons. And yet, here he was, a good man in a place that didn't care. His life before all this had been one of discipline, service, and sacrifice. A Navy SEAL for 15 years, then a private military contractor, taking jobs the government couldn't officially sanction. He had worked security in war zones, extracted hostages, taken down dangerous men who would never see the inside of a courtroom. He had never been a saint, but he had never been a criminal either. And yet, he was now a convicted murderer, sentenced to die. The setup had been perfect. It had started with a simple job, a security contract in Mexico, protecting a corporate executive with cartel enemies. Boone had done dozens of assignments like it before. It had gone off without a hitch, no complications, no violence. And then, the moment he stepped off the plane back home, the feds had been waiting. They had the evidence. His fingerprints on bullet casings, a money trail connecting his accounts to cartel payments, a witness swearing he had executed an informant. Boone had laughed the first time he heard the charges. It was so absurd that he had thought, for just a second, that it was all some kind of mistake. But it wasn't. The cartel had planned this for years. Rodrigo Castillo. Boone had crippled his operation in a classified mission years ago, disrupting his smuggling routes, taking out his enforcers. But Castillo had survived. He had rebuilt, and when Boone had taken a new job in his territory, Castillo had seen his opportunity. He hadn't just wanted Boone dead. He had wanted him erased. The trial had been a farce. Boone had watched the jury, saw the way they looked at him, not as a man, but as a weapon, a soldier with too many bodies to his name. His lawyer had fought hard, but the case was too airtight, too orchestrated. The verdict had been guilty. The sentence? Death. Boone had been angry at first. Then he had been numb. And now? Now he was just focused on staying alive. Because Castillo wasn't willing to wait for the state to execute him. The cartel ran this prison. They had men inside, inmates and guards alike, all on Castillo's payroll. Boone wasn't supposed to last a week here. The attacks had started the first night. A man with a sharpened toothbrush had lunged at him in his cell, and Boone had left him in a heap on the floor, his arm bent in 3 places. The next attempt had been in the showers. 3 men with makeshift blades, 2 left unconscious, 1 with a broken jaw. And it hadn't stopped since. The reason was simple. If Boone survived long enough, the truth might come out. His lawyer had already started digging. There were inconsistencies in the witness testimony, questions about the evidence chain. And then there was the leak, an anonymous source suggesting that Boone had been framed. That was the cartel's real fear, that someone would prove Boone was innocent before they could kill him. So now they were escalating. Every day Boone saw new men watching him from across the yard. They weren't even subtle about it anymore. The whispers, the exchanged glances, the coiled anticipation of another attempt. He had already taken down 5 men in a month, but the cartel wasn't backing off. He exhaled slowly, scanning the yard, watching the ones who were watching him, the ones plotting. He had been fighting alone since he got here. That had to change. If they wanted him dead so badly, he was going to make them fight for it, and he wasn't just going to survive, he was going to win. The walls of Greystone's visitation room were stained with years of cigarette smoke and bad decisions, the kind of place where time stretched unbearably long, and hope felt like a foreign concept. A thick sheet of bulletproof glass separated the prisoners from their visitors, each conversation reduced to murmurs beneath the steady hum of failing fluorescent lights. The guards stood nearby, pretending not to listen, though Boone knew better. They always listened. He had been dragged from the yard an hour ago, escorted down the long, soulless corridors of Greystone, past rows of cells where men either plotted murder or waited to die. The transition from the chaos of prison life to the suffocating silence of the visitation room always felt jarring. Here, in this small, dimly lit space, the war raging inside the prison walls seemed distant. But Boone knew better than to believe in illusions. He sat on the metal stool, rolling his shoulders to loosen the tension that never really left. His ribs still ached from the last fight, but pain was something he had long ago learned to live with. On the other side of the glass sat Zane Porter, his lawyer, looking far too polished for a man who spent most of his time elbow-deep in the dirt of the justice system. Porter leaned forward, his suit crisp, his sharp green eyes scanning Boone the way a man sizes up a bad hand in poker. "You look rough," he said. Boone smirked, resting his forearms on the metal ledge beneath the glass. "You should see the other guys." Porter exhaled through his nose, his fingers drumming against the folder in front of him. Boone recognized the movement. It meant bad news was coming. "Tell me," Boone said, his voice even. "What did you find?" Porter hesitated. That wasn't like him. Boone had met plenty of lawyers in his life. But Porter wasn't the type to waste time. He was aggressive, sharp, a man who fought like a rabid dog when he smelled blood. That hesitation wasn't a good sign. Porter leaned in. "It's getting worse," he said, voice low. "The cartel isn't just trying to keep you locked up. They're tightening their grip on the case. The lead witness? Dead. Car accident. Convenient timing." Boone's jaw tightened. "And the evidence?" Porter shook his head. "Still buried. I'm working on it. But every time I push, someone pushes back harder. This thing is locked down tight. I don't have proof yet, but I'd bet everything I own that there are high-level people making sure you never walk free." Boone already knew that. He had known from the moment they stuck him in Greystone, the worst prison in the country, the one controlled by the very people who wanted him dead. Still, hearing it out loud put a weight in his chest. "That's the outside," Boone said. "What about the appeals?" Porter frowned. "They're stalling, dragging their feet, waiting for you to disappear. They know the longer you stay in here, the higher the chance you end up another statistic. Another statistic. Another inmate who didn't make it to trial." Boone ran his tongue over his teeth, considering. "So what you're saying is, I don't have time." Porter nodded. "Not much." Boone leaned back slightly, rolling his shoulders again, forcing himself to stay loose, stay in control. He could feel the weight of Porter's stare, waiting for some kind of reaction, maybe anger or frustration. But Boone didn't deal in wasted emotions. He dealt in solutions. "Things are moving in here, too," Boone said finally. "They're getting bolder. The last guy came at me in the showers. 3-on-1, boxed me in. Cartel's running out of patience." Porter's fingers curled into fists against the table. "How bad?" Boone smirked, but there was no humor in it. "I'm still here, aren't I?" The lawyer's face was a mask of frustration. "Boone, you can't keep fighting them off forever." "I don't plan to." Porter narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Boone exhaled slowly, tilting his head as he watched a guard step closer, pretending to check his watch. They were always listening. Didn't matter. Boone had nothing to hide. "I mean, it's time I stopped playing defense." Porter didn't flinch, but Boone knew him well enough to see the flicker of understanding behind his eyes. "You have a plan," Porter said flatly. "Yeah," Boone said, voice calm. "I do." Porter hesitated. He wasn't a man who scared easily, but he wasn't reckless either. "Boone, listen to me. If you make too many moves in here, it could backfire. They could isolate you, put you in the hole, cut you off from me completely." Boone knew that was a risk, but he also knew what wasn't an option: sitting back and waiting to die. "They're coming for me no matter what," Boone said, voice low but steady. "I might as well make them bleed for it." Porter sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "You're a stubborn man, you know that?" Boone's smirk returned. "That's why you like me." Porter didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more serious. "I'll keep pushing on the outside. But Boone, you need to make it to that appeal. No reckless moves." Boone met his gaze. "Reckless gets men killed. I don't do reckless." Porter studied him for another long moment, then nodded, standing. "I'll be back in a week. Try not to get shanked before then." Boone watched him go, his lawyer's words still ringing in his ears. Try not to get shanked. Yeah, he'd work on that. When the guards finally yanked him from his seat and led him back through the long corridors, he could already feel the shift in the air. The yard would be different now. The men watching him would be more desperate, more willing to take a chance. He had just made it clear he wasn't backing down. The war was already starting. The walk back from visitation was always the same. Long, tense, and filled with the kind of silence that meant something was coming. The guards led Boone through a maze of dimly lit corridors, past rows of steel-barred cells where men lurked in the shadows, watching, whispering. The air was thick with sweat. the stench of unwashed bodies, and something else. The slow rot of men who had been here too long, who had lost whatever piece of themselves had once belonged to the outside world. Boone wasn't one of them. Not yet. The minute they entered D Block, Boone could feel the weight of every pair of eyes settle on him. The hierarchy inside Greystone was built on blood. Who controlled what? Who lived? Who got fed? Who got protection? And who was disposable? The cartel ran everything, and Boone was their biggest problem. At the top was Hector Rivas, the man who had ordered Boone dead the moment he stepped into Greystone. Rivas had been a cartel enforcer before he got locked up, but prison hadn't weakened him. It had given him a throne. He was short, wiry, and covered in tattoos, with a face that never smiled. A man who had killed his way to power and wasn't about to let Boone disrupt his empire. Boone had already taken out 5 of his men in the last month, and he knew Rivas wouldn't let that stand much longer. Then there were the soldiers, the ones who did the dirty work, the killers, the enforcers, the men who controlled the drugs, the weapons, and the flow of money inside these walls. They walked the yard like they owned it because, in a way, they did. Their loyalty was to Rivas, but their orders came from the outside, from Castillo. Boone wasn't fighting just one man in here. He was fighting an entire system designed to kill him. And then there were the guards. Half of them were bought, paid off, turning a blind eye to whatever the cartel needed. The others, they just didn't care. They saw men like Boone as animals locked in a cage, waiting to tear each other apart. The warden had made it clear from day one there would be no favors, no protection, no concern for Boone's survival. If he lived, he lived. If he died, paperwork would be filed, and the world would move on. But Boone wasn't entirely alone. There were men who hated the cartel just as much as he did. Dante Alvarez was one of them. A former gang leader from the streets of Los Angeles, Dante had run with his own crew before the cartel had crushed them, forcing his people into servitude or the grave. Dante had refused to bend, and now he was trapped in Greystone, surrounded by enemies on all sides. Boone had seen the way Dante watched him, the way he measured every move Boone made, waiting to see if he was just another man trying to survive or something else entirely. They had never spoken more than a few words to each other, but Boone could feel it. Dante was waiting for something, a reason, a spark. There were others too. Smiley was an old-timer, a man who had been in Greystone so long he had stopped counting the years. He was a lifer, no alliances, no debts, just a man who had seen it all and didn't care anymore. But he knew things. He watched everything, heard everything. And Boone knew information was sometimes more valuable than muscle. And then there were the new bloods, men who had no loyalty yet, who were looking for something to hold on to. Boone could see it in their eyes. They hated the cartel, but they were afraid. That fear wouldn't last forever. Boone had seen it before. The moment men realized they had nothing left to lose, they became dangerous. He just had to light the match. The daily routine inside Greystone was designed to break men. Wake up before dawn to the sound of cell doors clanking open, the stench of sweat and filth pressing in from all sides. Line up for breakfast, a gray, flavorless pile of slop dumped onto a plastic tray. Then came the yard, 30 minutes of so-called freedom, where every step had to be measured, every glance calculated, because a wrong move could mean a blade in the ribs. Then work duty, cleaning, kitchen shifts, maintenance, anything to keep the prisoners busy, to keep them from thinking too much. Then back to the cells, then dinner, then lights out, and then the real violence began. Nighttime was when men disappeared, when debts were collected, when men who had outlived their usefulness were found hanging in their cells, when the weak were taken, when the strong became targets. Boone had survived a month of this. 1 month of constant attacks. 1 month of fighting off killers, avoiding poisoned food, dodging ambushes in the showers, watching men bleed out on the concrete floor because They had crossed the wrong people. And he wasn't just going to survive the next month. He was going to take this place apart, brick by brick. Boone sat on the edge of his cot, back against the cold cement wall, listening to the sounds of the prison settling into its nightly rhythm. The distant echo of fists pounding against steel, muffled curses, the occasional scream that no one ever answered. Tomorrow, it would start. Tomorrow, Boone would stop playing defense, and Greystone would never be the same again. Morning in Greystone came like a hammer to the skull, loud, merciless, and full of bad intentions. The sharp clang of metal doors crashing open echoed through the cell block, followed by the guards barking orders. The air was stale, thick with the kind of tension that never really left, and Boone could already feel the weight of what was coming. He rolled his shoulders, pushing himself off the cot, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who knew every step had to be calculated, measured, controlled. He was still breathing, still standing, but that wouldn't last much longer if he kept waiting for the cartel to make their next move. It was time to make his own. The guards herded the inmates out for breakfast, forcing them into a slow-moving line toward the mess hall. Boone stayed near the back, eyes sweeping the room, cataloging the faces, the movement, the subtle shifts in body language that always preceded violence. The cartel soldiers were watching him, same as always, but today there was something different. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. Boone had spent his life reading situations like this. This wasn't just another test, another warning. This was a setup. He had two options: wait for it to hit him, or hit first. He grabbed his tray of inedible slop and moved toward the far end of the mess hall, where the unaligned inmates sat. Men who didn't have protection, who lived on the edges of power, staying silent and unnoticed. Boone didn't have time for subtlety anymore. He needed to move now. And that meant Dante Alvarez. Dante sat alone, leaning back against the cold brick wall, arms crossed, unreadable expression on his face. He was a man who had built his own power without bending the knee, and that had put him on the cartel's list a long time ago. Boone dropped his tray across from him and sat down. Dante didn't look up at first. He let the silence stretch, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table, his dark eyes finally flicking up to meet Boone's. "This gonna be a problem?" Dante asked, his voice low, unreadable. "Depends," Boone said. "You like breathing?" Dante smirked, shaking his head. "You got a death wish, man?" Boone leaned in slightly, voice calm, even. "I've been here a month. The cartel wants me dead, and I've taken out 5 of their guys. That means one of 2 things. Either they're incompetent, or they're getting ready to send someone who isn't." Dante didn't deny it. He just watched, calculated. "Problem is," Boone continued, "when that happens, they're not just gonna stop with me. You think they want men like you walking around when I'm gone? Men who don't kneel? They'll gut this whole block to make a point." Dante's smirk faded. Boone let the words sink in before he continued. "So, here's the deal. You want to keep playing lone wolf. Be my guest. But we both know that gets you a shiv in the ribs sooner or later. Or we do something about it." Dante exhaled slowly, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "And what exactly do you think we're gonna do?" Boone glanced around the room, lowering his voice to match. "We start cutting the head off the snake. One by one." Dante's jaw tightened, his fingers curling against the table. Boone let the moment stretch before he continued. "I don't need you to like me. I don't need trust. I just need you to be smart enough to see what's coming." Dante studied him for a long moment, then finally nodded. Not agreement, but understanding. "You're crazy," Dante muttered. "Probably," Boone admitted, "but I'm still alive." Dante let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "So what's the plan, tough guy?" Boone's eyes flicked to the far side of the mess hall, where Rivas sat surrounded by his enforcers, eating like he didn't have a worry in the world. "The first step," Boone said, voice quiet. "We take away their power." Dante frowned. "And how do you plan to do that?" Boone's smirk was cold. "We cut off their supply lines, their smuggling routes, the drugs, the money, the bribes, Everything that keeps them on top. Dante gave a dry chuckle. Yeah, sure. Let's just do that. Should be easy. Boone didn't blink. You know how they move product in here. You know who the weak links are. All we need is one. Dante's smirk faded. He stared at Boone for a long moment, then finally exhaled, shaking his head. You're out of your mind, he muttered again. Boone took a slow bite of his food, smirking. So is that a yes? Dante sighed, rubbing his temples. I'm gonna regret this. Probably. Dante looked at Boone one last time before nodding, barely perceptible. All right, let's make some trouble. Boone felt the shift immediately. The war had officially begun. The deal was made. Boone and Dante had set the first piece in motion, but in a place like Greystone, nothing happened without consequences. The morning after their conversation in the mess hall, Boone moved with purpose through the routine. The same breakfast of cold, gray slop, the same yard rotations, the same distant glares from the cartel soldiers who still controlled everything. But something had changed. The air was different now. They knew. Word traveled fast in Greystone, and Boone had no doubt that Hector Rivas already had men watching their every move. That was fine. Watching wasn't the same as stopping. Boone had spent his entire career walking through places where he wasn't supposed to survive. He knew how to maneuver, how to hit without getting hit back, how to make his enemies bleed before they even realized they were in a fight. And that started now. The first target was an inmate named Rico Salazar, a greasy, rat-faced man who had spent his entire sentence acting as a courier for the cartel. Rico didn't carry blades or muscle. He carried information. He was the reason Rivas always knew who was planning what, who was aligning with whom. Take out Rico, and the cartel lost its ears inside the prison. The setup was simple. Boone and Dante waited until the laundry detail was called, one of the few places in Greystone where there were no cameras, where the guards didn't bother supervising beyond locking and unlocking the doors. It was the perfect place to send a message. Rico walked in first, completely unaware that Boone was waiting in the shadows. Dante kept watch near the entrance while Boone struck. A quick, brutal grab. One hand clamped over Rico's mouth, the other twisting his arm behind his back until he was forced onto his knees. Do you know who I am? Boone asked, his voice calm. Rico thrashed, trying to turn his head, but Boone tightened his grip. You're gonna stop talking, Boone continued. No more messages, no more updates. Whatever Rivas asks you, you tell him nothing. Or, Boone pressed a knee against Rico's back, pushing just hard enough to make it clear he wasn't bluffing. You won't walk out of here. Rico's breathing turned shallow, his pulse a wild rhythm beneath Boone's hand. You understand me? Boone asked. A quick, frantic nod. Boone let go, stepping back, watching as Rico scrambled to his feet, gasping. Walk away, Boone said quietly. Make them think you were never here. Rico bolted without looking back. Dante exhaled through his nose. Subtle, he muttered. Boone smirked. He'll make sure Rivas knows exactly what happened. Let him stew on it. But Boone wasn't naive. He knew this wouldn't be the end of it. The cartel had survived inside Greystone for years because they didn't let threats go unanswered. They would hit back. The only question was when. That night, Boone sat on his cot, back against the cold cement wall, staring at the ceiling. The plan had to move faster. If they waited, the cartel would adjust. He needed something bigger than a scare tactic. He needed leverage. You're thinking too loud, Dante muttered from his own bunk. Boone didn't respond right away. He had spent years thinking through problems under pressure, working through obstacles when the odds were against him. Prison wasn't so different from a battlefield. You know how they move product in here, Boone said finally. Dante was quiet for a moment. Then, yeah, who runs the actual distribution? Boone asked. Not the enforcers. The guys who move it between blocks, handle the drops. Dante exhaled slowly. That'd be Miguel Ochoa and his crew. They're the ones that make sure every shipment gets where it needs to go. Rivas trusts them because they're smart enough not to get greedy, but dumb enough to be controlled. Boone nodded to himself. That was the weak spot. They get their orders directly from Rivas? Mostly. But Miguel's a middleman. He doesn't make decisions. He just follows them. Boone tapped his fingers against his knee, working through the angles. If they cut off the supply routes, they could choke the cartel's entire operation inside the prison. The drugs, the bribes, the smuggling, all of it ran through those networks. Dante seemed to be following his train of thought. "You're thinking about taking out Miguel, aren't you?" Boone shook his head. "Not yet. Killing him does nothing. Controlling him, though, that changes everything." Dante let out a low chuckle. "You're ambitious." Boone turned his head, meeting Dante's gaze. "You in?" Dante rolled his shoulders. "Rivas has had a hold on this place for too long. If we break that, he's got nothing." Boone leaned back against the wall, his mind already working through the details. If they could get to Miguel, they could make sure the next cartel shipment never made it to its destination. That would put the pressure on Rivas, force him to make mistakes. And in a place like Greystone, one mistake was all it took for a king to fall. Boone closed his eyes briefly, exhaling. Tomorrow, they'd make their move, and Greystone would never be the same again. Morning arrived with the same clang of metal doors and the echoing shouts of guards, but Boone knew today would be different. The quiet conversations between cartel members, the way Rivas's men watched him in the yard, it all pointed to a growing tension, a fuse burning toward an inevitable explosion. Boone needed leverage, and he knew exactly where to get it. Miguel Ochoa was a linchpin in Rivas's network, the one who moved contraband and information through the prison. Taking him out directly would be too obvious, too messy, and would bring the full weight of the cartel crashing down on Boone and Dante. Instead, Boone needed to make Miguel come to him. As the inmates gathered for their brief yard time, Boone and Dante positioned themselves near the edge of the exercise area, casually watching as Miguel coordinated a handoff with another inmate. The exchange was subtle, almost imperceptible. A small package slipped from one hand to another, disguised by a handshake. Dante leaned in, voice low. "You sure about this?" Boone nodded. "We need him nervous. If he feels like he's being watched, he'll start making mistakes." They waited until Miguel finished the handoff, then approached him casually, as if they were merely passing by. Boone let his gaze linger just long enough for Miguel to notice. "Problem, Boone?" Miguel asked, his tone guarded. Boone shook his head, a faint smirk on his lips. "Just watching the show. Seems like you're running quite the operation here." Miguel's eyes narrowed. "Mind your business." Boone shrugged, turning away. "Sure. Not like Rivas needs to know you're skimming off the top, right?" The accusation hung in the air, thick and heavy. Miguel's posture stiffened, and Dante barely suppressed a grin. Boone hadn't accused Miguel of anything specific, but the seed was planted. Paranoia could be more destructive than any weapon. Later that day, Boone made sure to be in the mess hall, seated in clear view of Miguel. He exchanged a few quiet words with Dante, their conversation deliberately ambiguous, casting glances in Miguel's direction just enough to make him uneasy. By the time dinner rolled around, Miguel was visibly on edge, casting furtive glances over his shoulder, his movements more jerky, less confident. Boone and Dante continued their silent campaign, never confronting him directly, but making it clear that Miguel was on their radar. It was during evening lockdown that Miguel finally cracked. As the guards secured the cells, Miguel slipped a note to one of the lower-level inmates, a request for a meeting with Rivas, a move he wouldn't have made unless he felt cornered. Boone watched the exchange from his cell, a faint smile playing at his lips. Miguel was trapped, not by force, but by his own fear of being discovered. By making Miguel think he was under surveillance, Boone had forced him to reveal his vulnerabilities. When lights out came, Boone leaned back against the cold concrete wall of his cell, his mind already moving to the next step. Now that Miguel was scrambling to cover his tracks, Boone could exploit the cracks forming in the cartel's network. The plan wasn't to take out Miguel, it was to make him a liability to Rivas. If Boone could sow enough doubt, Rivas would start questioning everyone around him, his paranoia causing more damage than any direct attack ever could. Dante's voice drifted over from the adjacent cell. "Think he's sweating enough?" "Not yet," Boone replied quietly. but he will be. The key wasn't just to disrupt the cartel's operations, but to turn them against each other. If Rivas believed his own people couldn't be trusted, he'd tighten his grip, alienating those who supported him. A divided cartel was a weak cartel, and Boone knew that weakness would be their downfall. Tomorrow, they'd start redirecting some of Miguel's shipments, making it look like Miguel was losing control or, worse, that he was double-crossing Rivas. The fallout would force Rivas to either replace Miguel or retaliate against him, creating the chaos Boone needed to seize control. As the prison settled into the uneasy quiet of the night, Boone felt the shift. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was a campaign, a strategy, a slow dismantling of the power structure that had ruled Greystone for too long. And Boone was ready for the next move. Morning arrived like a slow-moving storm. The air in the yard was different, heavier, charged with the kind of tension that signaled something was coming. Boone had spent enough time in war zones to recognize the shift, the way men stood differently, the way conversations were shorter, more hushed. Everyone knew what was about to happen. Then Rivas walked in. He moved like he owned the place, because for years he had. The guards didn't stop him. The other inmates didn't challenge him. He didn't need his usual muscle today. Not for this. Boone watched as Rivas walked straight toward him, his smirk sharp, calculated. The silence in the yard spread like a ripple, men stepping back instinctively, giving them space. The guards were still watching, still doing their jobs, but everyone understood this wasn't something they were going to stop. Rivas stopped a few feet away, studying Boone, shaking his head with something that almost looked like disappointment. "You just couldn't let it go, could you?" Rivas said, his voice smooth but laced with something darker. "Had to poke at something that didn't belong to you." Boone didn't respond. He simply waited. Rivas exhaled, tapping his fingers against his knuckles. "See? Here's the thing, Boone. You were dead the moment you stepped in here. The bosses on the outside, they didn't want you making it to that appeal. They gave me one job. Make sure you never leave Greystone alive." He let that sink in before continuing. "But I figured, why rush it? You were stuck in here anyway. No way out. No one coming to save you. I thought, might as well have some fun first." He tilted his head slightly. "But then you had to start acting like you had options." Boone's expression remained unreadable, but inside, his mind was already moving. Rivas leaned in slightly. "I know about Miguel. And Rico." That got a reaction. Boone kept his face neutral. But Rivas saw the subtle shift, the awareness that his moves had been tracked. "You thought you were being clever, didn't you?" Rivas chuckled. "Messing with my network. Whispering in ears. Making my men question things. That little game with Rico? Cute. And Miguel? Oh, that one really got my attention." Boone still didn't speak. Rivas's smirk faded. "Here's the problem, Boone. You're stepping into something bigger than you understand. You think this is about Greystone? About me?" He exhaled, shaking his head. "The men who run things outside, the ones who pull the real strings, they don't care about you. They don't care about this prison. But they do care when a loose end starts making noise." He took another step forward. "So, I got my orders." His voice dropped lower. "I don't get to play with you anymore." Boone met his gaze, his voice calm. "So, it's tonight, then?" Rivas nodded. Tonight, there was no bluff, no theatrics. It was a death sentence. Boone exhaled slowly. "Good." Rivas narrowed his eyes. "You don't look worried." Boone smirked. "Maybe you should be." For the first time, Rivas hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. Then he stepped back, adjusting his sleeves, his expression smoothing over. "I'll see you tonight, Boone." And with that, he turned and walked away. The yard slowly came back to life, but Boone didn't move. He already knew what was coming. Tonight, Greystone would become a battlefield. Boone sat in his cell, back against the cold wall, staring at the ceiling. The muffled sounds of Greystone settling into its nightly routine echoed through the corridors. Distant shouts, the occasional clatter of metal, the murmurs of men who had survived another day. But Boone wasn't thinking about making it through the day anymore. He had been too confident. He thought he had control. Thought he had time to slowly dismantle Rivas's operation piece by piece. He had been strategic, methodical, careful. But he hadn't been fast enough. Now, he was out of time. His fingers curled into fists as he replayed the conversation in the yard. I got my orders. I don't get to play with you anymore. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Rivas wasn't trying to push him out of the game, wasn't trying to send a message. This was an execution, and Boone wasn't sure if he could stop it. The thought unsettled him in a way he wasn't used to. He had spent most of his life on the other side of these situations, the one preparing the ambush, the one eliminating the threats. But now, he was the hunted, and for the first time since stepping into Greystone, he felt it, the weight of real fear. He pushed the feeling down. Fear was useful, but only if he controlled it. He didn't have time to doubt himself. He needed a plan. Boone sat up slowly, running through every scenario he could think of. Rivas had the manpower. He wasn't just sending a few guys after Boone. This was an order from the outside. That meant Rivas couldn't afford to fail. He would bring as many men as he needed to get the job done. 5? 10? More? If Rivas was serious about ending this, he wouldn't leave it to chance. That meant the fight would be brutal, and Boone couldn't win it alone. He had spent a month learning the layout, watching the patterns, mapping out escape routes and blind spots. He needed to use every inch of that knowledge. Where would Rivas make his move? Not the yard, not the mess hall, too many eyes. It would be in the corridors or near the showers, somewhere isolated. And if Boone knew where it would happen, he could set the terms of the fight. Dante. Boone's mind locked onto the only man in Greystone who could stand beside him when it counted. Dante wasn't a friend, wasn't someone Boone could trust completely, but he hated Rivas. That was enough. Boone found Dante leaning against the railing outside his cell, arms crossed, watching the floor below. You don't usually come looking for me, Dante muttered without looking at him. Boone didn't waste time. Rivas is making his move tonight. Dante's posture didn't change, but his eyes flickered with something sharp. How bad? Worst case scenario? He sends 10 men. Best case? 5. Either way, I don't walk out of it alone. Dante finally turned to him, studying Boone's expression. And you want me to jump in the fire with you? Boone nodded. Dante let the silence stretch before speaking. I don't take suicide missions, Boone. It's not suicide, Boone said. Not if we hit first. Dante frowned. You got a plan? Boone exhaled. I'm working on it. Dante scoffed. Not good enough. Boone stepped closer, lowering his voice. I don't need you to like the plan. I need you to understand something. If they kill me tonight, they're coming for you next. You think Rivas is going to let you keep walking around after I'm gone? He'll clear out anyone who ever stood near me. Dante didn't flinch, but Boone could see the wheels turning. After a long pause, Dante exhaled through his nose. Fine, he straightened. But if we're doing this, we're not just fighting to survive. Boone nodded. We end this. Dante grinned, cracking his knuckles. Now you're talking. Boone knew the fight was inevitable. But now, he wasn't just reacting. He was controlling it. The fear was still there, buried under adrenaline and cold calculation. But that was fine. Fear kept men alive. And tonight, he was going to make Rivas regret underestimating him. The prison felt different at night. It always did. The quiet wasn't real. Just a thin layer of silence covering something darker. Boone could feel it in his bones, in the stale air pressing against his skin. He had been in places like this before. Places where death moved in the shadows, where the wrong step meant you didn't see morning. Tonight was one of those nights. Dante stood a few feet away, his back against the cell bars, rolling his shoulders loose. He wasn't nervous. Not the way most men would be. But Boone could see it. The sharpness in his gaze. The way his weight shifted slightly from one foot to the other. He knew what was coming. The lights had dimmed for lockdown. Any minute now. How many? Dante asked, his voice barely a whisper. Too many. Boone muttered back. A few of the guards had been bought off. That much was clear. Rivas wasn't sending a few men to send a message. He was sending enough to make sure Boone never walked out of his cell again. There was no running from this. They were coming. Boone's fingers flexed at his sides. He wasn't a religious man, but there were moments in life where time slowed down just enough for him to hear something underneath the noise. Some quiet understanding of what was about to happen. He had felt it in combat. In those seconds before a mission turned bloody, he felt it now. And then it happened. The first sound was the click of a lock sliding open. Not Boone's, not Dante's. Down the tier, past the row of cells, the second sound was footsteps, fast and heavy. Then the yelling started. Dante barely had time to curse before the first man came barreling toward them, blade in hand, eyes wild. Boone moved first, grabbing the attacker's wrist before the blade could sink into Dante's ribs, twisting hard enough to snap bone. The man screamed, stumbling back, and Boone drove his knee into his stomach before shoving him into the bars. More men were pouring in. Dante didn't wait. He lunged at the second attacker, catching him in the throat with an elbow before yanking him down into a brutal knee strike. The man collapsed, gasping, but there was no time to finish him. 3 more were rushing in. Boone barely ducked in time to avoid a shiv aimed for his neck. He caught the attacker's wrist, twisting him off balance, but another man tackled him from the side, sending them both crashing against the cold concrete. The fight descended into chaos. Boone landed 2 hard punches, knocking his attacker off balance, but before he could get up, a boot connected with his ribs, sharp pain flaring through his side. He gritted his teeth, rolling, just as another blade slashed down, barely missing his shoulder. Dante was brawling with 2 men at once, fists flying, elbows cracking into jaws. Blood dripped from his lip, but he didn't slow down, dodging a wild punch and driving one of his own into a man's stomach. Boone felt another kick coming, twisting just in time to grab the attacker's leg and yank him off balance. The man hit the floor hard, and Boone followed, raining down 2 quick, brutal punches before rolling away. Barely avoiding another attack, the air reeked of sweat and blood, the sound of fists hitting flesh, the grunts of pain, the heavy breathing of men locked in a fight where losing meant dying. More men were coming. Boone's mind was racing, looking for an opening, a way to turn the fight in their favor. They couldn't hold this spot forever. Then he saw it, the hallway leading toward the maintenance corridor. It was tight, narrow. Only 1 or 2 men could fight at a time. If they moved now, they could force Rivas's men into a bottleneck, take them on one at a time instead of being swarmed. "Dante!" Boone shouted between breaths. "Back! Move back!" Dante barely hesitated. He shoved his attacker away, grabbing Boone's arm as they pushed toward the corridor. The cartel soldiers hesitated for a fraction of a second. Just enough time for Boone to grab a loose piece of metal from the floor and swing it hard against the nearest man's head. The attacker crumpled, blood smearing against the wall. Then Boone and Dante were in the corridor. A tight, enclosed space. Exactly what they needed. Rivas's men started to funnel in after them, but now they couldn't attack all at once. Boone tightened his grip on the metal shard. This fight was far from over. The prison felt different at night. It always did. The quiet wasn't real. Just a thin layer of silence covering something darker. Boone could feel it in his bones, in the stale air pressing against his skin. He had been in places like this before. Places where death moved in the shadows, where the wrong step meant you didn't see morning. Tonight was one of those nights. Dante stood a few feet away, his back against the cell bars, rolling his shoulders loose. He wasn't nervous, not the way most men would be, but Boone could see it. The sharpness in his gaze, the way his weight shifted slightly from one foot to the other. He knew what was coming. The lights had dimmed for lockdown. Any minute now. "How many?" Dante asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Too many," Boone muttered back. A few of the guards had been bought off. That much was clear. Rivas wasn't sending a few men to send a message. He was sending enough to make sure Boone never walked out of his cell again. There was no running from this. They were coming. Boone's fingers flexed at his sides. He wasn't a religious man, but there were moments in life where time slowed down just enough for him to hear something underneath the noise. Some quiet understanding of what was about to happen. He had felt it in combat. In those seconds before a mission turned bloody, he felt it now. And then it happened. The first sound was the click of a lock sliding open. Not Boone's, not Dante's. Down the tier, past the row of cells, the second sound was footsteps, fast and heavy. Then the yelling started. Dante barely had time to curse before the first man came barreling toward them, blade in hand, eyes wild. Boone moved first, grabbing the attacker's wrist before the blade could sink into Dante's ribs, twisting hard enough to snap bone. The man screamed, stumbling back, and Boone drove his knee into his stomach before shoving him into the bars. More men were pouring in. Dante didn't wait. He lunged at the second attacker, catching him in the throat with an elbow before yanking him down into a brutal knee strike. The man collapsed, gasping, but there was no time to finish him. 3 more were rushing in. Boone barely ducked in time to avoid a shiv aimed for his neck. He caught the attacker's wrist, twisting him off balance, but another man tackled him from the side, sending them both crashing against the cold concrete. The fight descended into chaos. Boone landed 2 hard punches, knocking his attacker off balance, but before he could get up, a boot connected with his ribs, sharp pain flaring through his side. He gritted his teeth, rolling, just as another blade slashed down, barely missing his shoulder. Dante was brawling with 2 men at once, fists flying, elbows cracking into jaws. Blood dripped from his lip, but he didn't slow down, dodging a wild punch and driving one of his own into a man's stomach. Boone felt another kick coming, twisting just in time to grab the attacker's leg and yank him off balance. The man hit the floor hard, and Boone followed, raining down 2 quick, brutal punches before rolling away, barely avoiding another attack. The air reeked of sweat and blood, the sound of fists hitting flesh, the grunts of pain, the heavy breathing of men locked in a fight where losing meant dying. More men were coming. Boone's mind was racing, looking for an opening, a way to turn the fight in their favor. They couldn't hold this spot forever. Then he saw it, the hallway leading toward the maintenance corridor. It was tight, narrow. Only 1 or 2 men could fight at a time. If they moved now, they could force Rivas's men into a bottleneck, take them on one at a time instead of being swarmed. "Dante!" Boone shouted between breaths. "Back! Move back!" Dante barely hesitated. He shoved his attacker away, grabbing Boone's arm as they pushed toward the corridor. The cartel soldiers hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough time for Boone to grab a loose piece of metal from the floor and swing it hard against the nearest man's head. The attacker crumpled, blood smearing against the wall. Then Boone and Dante were in the corridor, a tight, enclosed space, exactly what they needed. Rivas's men started to funnel in after them, but now they couldn't attack all at once. Boone tightened his grip on the metal shard. This fight was far from over. The corridor was tight, dark, and unforgiving. The kind of space where men fought like animals because there was nowhere else to go. Boone dug his heels in, gripping the jagged piece of metal in his hands, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. The air stank of sweat, blood, and rage. Dante stood beside him, rolling his shoulders loose, his lips split, his breath steady despite the chaos behind them. There was no turning back now. The first man lunged into the corridor, wild and reckless. A mistake. Boone didn't hesitate. He sidestepped the charge, grabbed the man's wrist, and slammed the jagged metal into his forearm. A sharp scream filled the corridor as the attacker staggered back, clutching his arm. But Boone was already moving, slamming an elbow into his face and sending him crashing into the wall. Another man forced his way in. Dante met him head-on. A sharp hook to the ribs, a knee to the stomach. The man crumbled, but not before another rushed forward, swinging a blade wildly. Boone barely twisted in time, the shiv slicing through his sleeve, cutting shallow into his arm. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but he ignored it. He caught the man's wrist, twisting hard, forcing the blade free before driving his forehead into the attacker's nose. The wet crunch of bone breaking filled the air. More were coming. The bottleneck worked in their favor, but Boone knew they couldn't stay here forever. All Rivas had to do was send enough men, keep them pinned, and eventually exhaustion would set in. A thunderous roar of pain made Boone turn his head just in time to see Dante rip a blade from an attacker's grip and slam it into the man's thigh. The cartel soldier howled, collapsing to the ground, clutching at the wound as blood pooled beneath him. "How long we holding this spot?" Dante growled, wiping blood from his chin. Boone's mind raced. They needed to move, but the moment they left the corridor, they were back in open ground. The guards wouldn't interfere, not unless bodies started piling up in a way that couldn't be ignored. Another attacker forced his way in. Boone barely had time to react before a blade flashed toward his side. He twisted, but not fast enough. The knife sliced into his ribs, shallow but deep enough to make his vision go white for a second. Boone gritted his teeth and used the momentum. He grabbed the attacker's arm and slammed him headfirst into the wall. The man slumped instantly. Unconscious or worse, Dante cursed under his breath. "You're bleeding." Not enough to stop. Boone wiped sweat from his brow, forcing himself to focus. They had to turn the tide now. Then he saw it. The attackers weren't as coordinated anymore. The first wave had been Rivas's best men, killers, enforcers. But now, the ones forcing their way in were younger, inexperienced. Boone's lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. "They're sending the weak ones now." Dante caught on instantly. "Means they're running out of good options." It was a gamble, but Boone had spent his life betting on his own survival. He took a step forward, into the tight crowd of remaining cartel soldiers still trying to push their way into the corridor. If Rivas was watching, he wanted him to see this. "You already lost," Boone said, his voice low, steady. "You think sending more bodies is going to change that?" One of the younger cartel members hesitated, his grip on his weapon faltering for just a second. Boone latched onto it. "You got two options," he continued. "Stay here, fight, and get fed to the concrete. Or you can walk. And if you walk now, maybe Rivas doesn't come looking for you next." The hesitation spread like an infection. The younger men started glancing at each other, the uncertainty sinking in. And then, one of them stepped back. Then another. Boone could see the moment Rivas's entire plan started to crumble. But Rivas wasn't done yet. From the far side of the corridor, more movement. A final wave, bigger, stronger. Rivas's last push. Boone exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. But now, Rivas was desperate. And desperate men made mistakes. Boone clenched his fists, ignoring the sting of his wounds, the exhaustion creeping into his limbs. One more push. Boone's breaths came heavy, his muscles screaming from the relentless assault, but he forced his body to keep moving. There was no room for exhaustion, no space for hesitation. He had trained for this, lived through worse, fought in conditions more brutal than anything these men could imagine. They weren't soldiers. They weren't killers, not in the way he was. They were prison thugs, street-level enforcers who had relied on numbers and fear their entire lives. Boone had spent his career taking men like this apart in the dark, in places where failure meant never going home. This was just another battlefield. The final wave came hard, the last men pushing into the corridor with desperation in their eyes, the stench of uncertainty mixing with blood and sweat. Rivas had sent everything he had, and Boone could feel it. The difference between the first wave of hardened enforcers and these men, less disciplined, more reckless, running on anger instead of strategy. That was a mistake. Boone didn't fight angry. He fought to end things. The first man rushed him, sloppy, a shiv clutched tight in his fist. Boone read the attack before it came, sidestepped at the last second, and drove his elbow into the man's throat. The attacker gagged, stumbling, and Boone grabbed his wrist, twisting it hard until the blade dropped to the floor. A single, brutal punch sent him crashing against the wall, unconscious. Another came from the left. Boone barely turned in time, but his training kicked in before thought could. He used the momentum, dropping low, sweeping the man's leg out from under him. As soon as he hit the ground, Boone was on top of him, driving his knee into his chest before slamming a fist into his temple. Two more rushed in together. Dante caught one, tackling him into the wall, fists swinging, raw and brutal. Boone turned to the other, dodging the wild swing of a makeshift club. Too slow, too predictable. Boone closed the distance fast, stepping into the man's guard, trapping his weapon arm and twisting him into a choke. The man thrashed, but Boone squeezed, cutting off his air, keeping him locked until he went limp. More men kept coming, but Boone's world had narrowed to calculated movements, precise strikes, no wasted energy. His body was battered, his ribs ached, but his mind remained sharp. He had trained for this, to fight when outnumbered, to break through waves of untrained enemies, to keep moving no matter what. A hard hit to the ribs nearly sent him stumbling. A fist cracked against his jaw. Pain blurred his vision for a second, but he recovered, slipping under another wild swing and driving his fist into the attacker's kidney. The bodies started piling up, some unconscious, some groaning, others too broken to get back up. The last man standing hesitated, glancing at the wreckage Boone and Dante had left behind. Boone saw the fear settle into his eyes. He wasn't a fighter, he was a follower, and right now, there was nothing left to follow. The man turned and ran. Boone exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders, his body aching from the sheer brutality of the fight. Then the alarm blared. The guards had finally decided to show up. Bright lights flooded the corridor. Heavy boots thundered down the walkways, shouts echoing through the prison. Boone barely registered it. His vision was tunneling, exhaustion wrapping around him like a weighted blanket. Dante wiped blood from his chin, glancing around at the aftermath. We made a mess. Boone let out a breath, his hands still clenched into fists. He could hear the guards shouting orders, their footsteps growing closer. They had let it go on long enough, but now they had no choice but to react. A moment later, 4 guards stormed in, weapons drawn, eyes scanning the devastation. One of them, the ranking officer, stared at the scene, his face a mask of shock. His gaze flicked from the unconscious bodies littering the corridor to Boone, bruised, bloodied, still standing. His voice was almost incredulous. "You did all this?" Boone didn't answer. The exhaustion finally hit him like a freight train, his body finally registering the toll of the fight. His knees buckled slightly. Dante caught his arm before he could collapse completely, his smirk laced with something between amusement and respect. "Not bad, Boone." The guards were already barking orders, ordering everyone to the ground, locking down the prison. Boone barely heard them. His heart was still pounding, his vision still blurred from the adrenaline leaving his system. He had won, but he wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about surviving the night. This was about the war still to come. Boone let out a slow breath, closing his eyes just for a second. Rivas had thrown everything at him, and Boone was still standing. Solitary was designed to break men, to strip them down to their most primal selves, to remind them that no one cared if they disappeared into these walls forever. Boone had seen it happen before, had watched strong men come out of the hole with something missing in their eyes, a piece of themselves left behind in the darkness. But he had spent too many nights alone in places worse than this, had learned to listen, to think, to wait. There was always something to hear if you paid attention. At first, it was just the usual. The clank of metal doors, the shuffle of boots against concrete, the distant murmur of guards talking just outside. Most of it was routine. Then a name caught his ear. "Rivas," one of them muttered, voice low, cautious. Boone didn't move, didn't react, just let his breathing slow as he focused. "They're done with him," the second guard said, frustration seeping into his tone. "Got word this morning. The outside bosses don't trust him anymore," the first guard scoffed. "Figures. He was supposed to take care of it quick, clean. Instead, he turns this place into a war zone. And now they've got us watching our backs, just as much as the inmates." Boone's pulse stayed steady, but something inside him shifted. The outside cartel had cut Rivas loose. That changed everything. "Place is a mess now," the first guard continued. "Lieutenants fighting each other. New guys trying to step up. They're all too busy trying to keep from getting stabbed to worry about finishing what Rivas started." The second guard let out a humorless laugh. "Good. Maybe they'll kill each other off before the warden decides to clean house. They're already talking about moving some of the high-risk guys out, breaking things up before it gets worse." Their voices faded as they walked down the corridor, leaving Boone alone with the weight of what he had just learned. He wasn't out of danger. That would be foolish to believe. But Rivas was no longer the threat he had been. The man who had tried to have him killed, the one with all the connections and the backing of an empire, was now a man fighting for scraps, trying to hold on to a throne that had already been taken from him. Boone had spent enough time in war zones to know what happened next. The scavengers would move in, tearing apart what was left, too busy with their own power struggles to care about an ex-Navy SEAL locked in a cage. For the first time in a long time, he liked his odds. He didn't need to fight anymore. He didn't need to start another war. If the cartel was turning on itself, then all Boone had to do was outlast them. He let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease just slightly. His lawyer was working. The case was moving, even if it was slow. If he could just stay alive long enough, the system would catch up. The evidence was there. The flaws in the case were unraveling, and the pressure was building. Sooner or later, someone would have to act. And when they did, Boone wouldn't be in Greystone anymore. That was his mission now. Not revenge, not control, not even survival in the way he had been thinking before. Just time. If he could buy himself a few more weeks, maybe a month, that would be enough. The cartel would finish tearing itself apart, the legal fight would reach its breaking point, and Boone would walk out of this place through the front gates instead of a body bag. He wasn't used to waiting. Every instinct in his body told him to move, to push, to strike first. But this wasn't a battlefield, and the rules were different. If he played this right, he wouldn't have to fight again. He closed his eyes, letting his head rest against the cold wall. The worst of it was over. Now, all he had to do was wait. The air in Greystone felt different when Boone stepped out of solitary. It wasn't a big change, not something the guards would notice, but Boone could feel it. The way the noise level in the block had shifted, the way men spoke in quieter voices, the way certain faces were missing from their usual places. It was the silence of uncertainty. Rivas was losing power. Boone had seen it happen before. A leader stumbles, takes a hit they weren't supposed to take, and suddenly the men who swore loyalty start looking for a new flag to stand under. In a place like Greystone, power didn't last unless you reminded people why they should fear you, and Rivas had failed to do that. The guards barely spoke as they led him through the block, though Boone caught a few sideways glances, some assessing, some irritated. They had wanted the cartel to handle him, wanted Boone to disappear into a prison scuffle so they wouldn't have to deal with the mess. But that hadn't happened. Boone was still standing, and now they had no idea what to do with him. He stepped back into the tier, moving toward his bunk, eyes sweeping the room. Some men watched him openly now, not hiding their curiosity, their calculations. Before, most of them had probably assumed he'd be dead within the first month. But now they weren't sure what to make of him. Boone wasn't sure what to make of it either. He spotted Dante leaning against the railing of the second level, arms crossed, watching the yard below. Boone made his way up, moving slow, feeling the stiffness in his ribs where the last fight had left its mark. Dante smirked as Boone stepped up beside him. "They let you out early." Boone exhaled. "Guess they missed me." Dante chuckled. "Yeah, That must be it. Nothing to do with the fact that half the block's still licking their wounds from that mess in the corridors. Boone didn't respond, just let his gaze move across the room, tracking the shifting alliances, the quiet conversations. How bad is it? Dante tilted his head slightly. Rivas is done. His crew's falling apart. Word is, the outside bosses cut him loose. That means the guys still loyal to him? They're trying to figure out where to land before they end up on the wrong side of a shank. Boone nodded slightly. He had expected as much. The cartel wasn't a family. It was a machine, and when a part stopped working, they didn't fix it. They replaced it. You worried about anyone stepping up? Boone asked. Dante shrugged. There's always someone willing to take the crown, but nobody's got the pull yet. They're too busy watching each other, waiting to see who makes the first move. That buys you time. Boone let out a slow breath. Time. That was all he needed now. He wasn't in the crosshairs anymore. Not the way he had been. He wasn't Rivas's problem, and with the cartel fighting among themselves, no one was looking at him as a priority. For the first time since stepping into Greystone, he wasn't a marked man. Dante studied him for a moment. You thinking of making a move? Boone shook his head. No more moves. I sit tight. Let them eat each other alive. Dante grinned. Smart. Let someone else take the heat for once. Boone didn't answer. His lawyer was working. The case was moving. He had fought his way through hell, but now he just had to survive long enough for the system to catch up. He leaned against the railing, exhaling slowly. For the first time since arriving at Greystone, he liked his chances. Boone felt the shift in the air before he saw him. Prison had a way of warning you, a subtle change in energy, the feeling of tension wrapping around the room like a coiled wire. He had been standing near his bunk, talking with Dante, when the low murmur of the block suddenly dipped, conversations tapering off, heads turning ever so slightly. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy with something dangerous. Boone didn't have to look to know who it was. Rivas. He turned just as the man stalked toward him, his face twisted with a fury that wasn't just anger. It was desperation. Rivas had lost his control over Greystone, had lost the trust of the outside cartel leaders, and now he was spiraling, looking for any way to claw back power before it slipped completely from his grasp. And Boone? Boone was the man who had shattered his reputation. Rivas wasn't coming for a conversation. Boone's gaze flicked downward, a makeshift shank. A sharpened piece of metal clutched tight in Rivas's grip, held low against his thigh to hide it from immediate view. The moment stretched. Dante tensed beside him, barely shifting his weight, eyes locked on the weapon. Boone kept his face neutral, body still, but his muscles were already coiling, calculating angles, distance, reaction time. If Rivas was going to make his move, it would be now. Rivas stopped just short of striking distance, breathing hard through his nose, shoulders rising and falling with the weight of his rage. You think this is over? His voice was quiet, but there was a sharpness to it, a barely contained violence. You think because I took a hit, I'm done? Boone met his gaze, steady, unreadable. You already lost. You just don't know it yet. Rivas's grip on the shank tightened. Boone saw the shift in his stance, the twitch in his fingers, the tell that he was about to lunge. It would be sloppy, desperate, uncalculated. The move of a man who had already lost control. Boone tensed. Then, Boone! A guard's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Heavy boots thudded against the concrete as one of the officers strode toward them, face set in irritation. Boone didn't flinch, didn't break eye contact with Rivas as the guard reached them. You've got a visitor, the officer muttered. Let's go. Boone watched as Rivas's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching against the weapon. His moment was gone. The guards weren't paying close enough attention to see the shank, but they were watching now, watching Boone. Rivas couldn't make his move without everyone seeing. For a second, Boone thought he might try anyway. But then Rivas stepped back, chest rising and falling like he was holding himself together by sheer force of will. His eyes burned with hatred. But Boone recognized what was underneath. fear. The man wasn't just angry. He was terrified. He was slipping, and he knew it. Boone smirked. Next time, bring a bigger knife. Rivas's lips curled back in a snarl, but before he could say another word, Boone turned and walked away, following the guard toward the visitation room. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Rivas was already dead. He just hadn't hit the ground yet. The walk to the visitation room felt different. Boone could tell from the way the guard moved. Too stiff, too focused. The usual indifference was gone, replaced with something else, something sharp. The air inside Greystone had shifted. Boone had spent his life reading danger before it struck. And right now, every nerve in his body told him something was coming, but no one said a word. The heavy door groaned open, and Boone stepped inside. Zane Porter sat on the other side of the thick, bulletproof glass, a stack of papers in front of him, his fingers pressed against his temples like he was trying to hold his skull together. He looked up the second Boone sat down, his eyes scanning him the way a man sizes up a crumbling bridge before stepping onto it. Boone picked up the phone, his voice even. "You look like hell." Porter let out a slow breath. "You have no idea." Boone leaned forward slightly, feeling the weight of something in the air. "What's going on?" Porter rubbed a hand down his face, glancing at the papers like he was still trying to make sense of them himself. "You're getting out, Boone." Boone went still. Not a muscle moved. Not a breath changed. His mind didn't process the words right away because they didn't belong inside this place. Not in his world. He waited. Porter exhaled sharply, like he knew exactly what Boone was thinking. "Your conviction's been overturned." Effective, immediately. The words should have landed like a hammer. Instead, they felt like the start of a setup. Boone had learned not to trust anything inside these walls. He had spent a month dodging shivs and ambushes, listening for the footstep that didn't belong, reading the shifts in power like the ripples of an oncoming storm. The cartel had fought too hard to keep him buried, sent too many men to kill him. They didn't just let him walk away. His voice was steady. "How?" Porter's lips pressed into a tight line, his jaw working like he was holding something back. "Someone pulled strings." The judge took another look at the case, the ballistics, the witness statements, all of it. The prosecution didn't have a leg to stand on. "The order was signed this morning." Boone's pulse stayed slow and measured, but his mind moved fast. This wasn't Porter's doing. The lawyer had been fighting like hell, but overturning a conviction this airtight in a matter of days? That wasn't the legal system working the way it should. That was power being flexed, a hand moving behind the curtain, cutting the strings that had held Boone inside Greystone. Boone exhaled through his nose. "Who made the call?" Porter didn't answer right away. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice even though there was no one to hear them but the guard stationed in the corner. "I don't know. That's what scares me." Boone let that sit between them. Porter wasn't a man who got rattled. He fought like a rabid dog when he smelled blood, ripped apart cases with surgical precision. But now, he looked like a man who had just realized he wasn't playing the game anymore. He was being moved around the board like the rest of them. Boone's grip tightened on the phone. "This isn't a favor. Someone wants me back out there." Porter nodded. "And I don't think it's out of the kindness of their heart." Boone thought of Rivas, the way the man had looked at him in the yard, the barely restrained fury masking something deeper, fear. The cartel had lost control of Greystone. Boone had made sure of that. But out there, the playing field was bigger, the pieces harder to see. If they were letting him out, it wasn't because they'd given up. It was because they had something waiting for him on the outside. The guard knocked on the glass. "Time's up." Porter leaned in one last time, his voice low and firm. "Listen to me, Boone. You step out of those gates, you're walking into a different kind of fight. Be ready." Boone didn't nod, didn't respond. He just set the phone down and stood, because he was always ready. The walk back to his cell was silent, but the air around him wasn't. He could feel the eyes, the shift in weight, the unspoken calculations happening in real time. Word was spreading already. The men who had tried to kill him, the ones who had been waiting for the next attempt, they all knew what this meant. Boone was leaving Greystone, and that meant he wasn't their problem anymore. It meant he was everyone else's. The steel doors of Greystone groaned as they slid open, the outside world spilling in with a rush of cold air, and a sky stretched wide and endless. Boone stepped forward, his boots hitting the pavement just outside the gate, but his mind was still inside. He had spent weeks fighting to stay alive in that place, measuring time in broken ribs and blood-stained knuckles. But now, standing outside, something felt off. Freedom didn't come this easy. Zane Porter was waiting by the curb, leaning against a sleek black SUV. No smile, no handshake, just a sharp, assessing gaze, as if he wasn't sure Boone was really standing there. He straightened as Boone approached, nodding toward the car. "Get in." Boone didn't ask questions. He slid into the passenger seat, feeling the smooth leather against his back. A stark contrast to the cold steel of a prison bench. The door shut, and Porter pulled away from the curb, the massive walls of Greystone shrinking in the rearview mirror. Boone didn't look back. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The city stretched out before them, a reminder that the world had kept moving without him. But Boone wasn't interested in skylines and traffic. He wanted answers. "You gonna tell me who I owe a thank you card to?" Boone finally asked. Porter's hands tightened on the wheel. "You're not gonna like it." Boone didn't blink. "Try me." Porter exhaled, glancing at him before returning his eyes to the road. "Your case didn't just collapse. Someone helped it along. Someone with power, connections, and a hell of a lot of motivation to see you walk free." Boone leaned back slightly, absorbing that. "Cartel?" Porter shook his head. "The opposite." Boone's jaw tightened. "Who?" Porter slowed at a red light, drumming his fingers against the wheel before finally saying it. "Castillo's enemies. Rodrigo Castillo, the man who had orchestrated Boone's downfall. The cartel leader who had put a bounty on his head before he ever stepped foot in Greystone. The man who had spent years climbing to the top of the underworld, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. Boone had crippled his operation once, years ago, and Castillo had never forgotten. Boone exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders, feeling the weight of it settle in. "They want me to take him out." Porter nodded. "You made a hell of a reputation for yourself in there. The way you handled yourself, the way you took down Rivas's men, they noticed. They think you're the best shot they've got at putting Castillo in the ground." Boone didn't answer right away. He let the car's quiet hum fill the space between them, let the pieces shift into place. This wasn't a rescue. This was a recruitment, a leash disguised as freedom. Porter glanced at him. "So, what's the move?" Boone flexed his fingers, staring out at the city, the endless maze of streets and high-rises that stretched beyond the windshield. He had spent a month fighting to stay alive, and now he had a choice. Walk away, disappear, start over, or step into another war. But deep down, he already knew the answer. If Castillo thought throwing him in a cage would make him disappear, he had underestimated the wrong man. Boone's smirk was slow, sharp, deadly. "Let's get to work." Boone didn't waste time. The second the car stopped in front of the hotel, he stepped out without waiting for Porter, scanning the area, reading the streets the way a soldier read a battlefield. The air was different here, too clean, too structured. No bars, no weight of a concrete cage pressing in from all sides. It should have felt good. It didn't. Porter led him through the hotel's side entrance, past the kind of security that didn't wear uniforms but still screamed government. Boone had worked with men like them before. Silent, alert, ready to put a bullet in him if he so much as twitched wrong. This wasn't some backroom deal with cartel rivals. This was bigger. Inside the suite, a man waited by the window, suit pressed, hands clasped, the kind of presence that didn't need to be loud to demand attention. He turned when Boone entered, and the look in his eyes was familiar, calculating, measuring, the way men looked at weapons before deciding whether to use them. "Mr. Boone," the man said, smooth, professional, with just enough edge to let Boone know he was someone who gave orders, not followed them. Boone didn't sit. He didn't ask questions. He just studied the man in return. "You the one who got me out?" The man nodded. "Director Philip Graves, National Intelligence Directorate." He motioned to the chair across from him. "Have a seat." Boone didn't move. "You gonna tell me why the U.S. government suddenly cares whether I rot in Greystone or not?" Graves smiled slightly. The kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Rodrigo Castillo has become a problem." Boone exhaled slowly. "So that's what this is. You let me out because you think I'll put him down for you." Graves folded his hands. "You're an asset, Mr. Boone, one with a very specific skill set and a very personal motivation. We didn't manufacture that. We just cleared the way." Boone knew what this was. It was the same game he'd played his whole career. Orders that weren't officially given, operations that didn't exist, objectives that weren't written down. The government didn't want Castillo taken down in a courtroom. They wanted him erased. Boone let the silence stretch before he finally spoke. "I'll do it, but I have a condition." Graves raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Dante Alvarez," Boone said. "He's still inside Greystone. He helped me stay alive in there. I want him moved. Somewhere safe. Somewhere out of reach." Graves tilted his head slightly, considering. "Alvarez. Former gang leader. He's no saint." Boone didn't blink. "Neither am I." Another pause. Graves studied him, the weight of a decision hanging in the air, then nodded once. "Done." Boone exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. The chains were off, but the leash was still there, just invisible now. He didn't care. He had a job to do. "Then let's get started." Boone sat in a cold, windowless room deep inside a government facility, a place built for men who operated in shadows and made decisions that never made it onto paper. The air was thick with the quiet hum of security systems, the slow, deliberate ticking of a clock that measured time in seconds, not lives. Across the steel table, Director Philip Graves sat with the kind of calm that came from being in control, from knowing the man sitting across from him wasn't here because he had a choice. He was here because someone had already decided he was the right tool for the job. On the wall behind Graves, a projector cast a grainy satellite image of a sprawling compound deep in the Yucatan jungle. The estate was massive, built like a fortress, surrounded by dense vegetation and high, reinforced walls. Armed patrols moved along the perimeter, watchtowers dotted the landscape, and a private airstrip stretched along the eastern side. Rodrigo Castillo's last stronghold. Boone didn't speak. He had been in enough of these rooms, listened to enough men like Graves lay out missions designed to sound like strategy, but always came down to one thing: kill the target. He waited. Graves clicked a remote, shifting the image to another slide. A surveillance photo of Castillo himself. The cartel kingpin stood beside a blacked-out SUV, mid-conversation with another high-ranking member, his posture exuding authority. The kind of power that came from knowing he was above the law. "You know why you're here," Graves said, voice smooth, practiced. "Castillo has spent years making himself untouchable. He owns politicians, law enforcement, even elements of the military. We've tried the legal approach. It doesn't work." Boone exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. "And now you want me to clean it up." Graves nodded. "Your time in Greystone did more than just keep you busy. It sent a ripple effect through the cartel. Rivas losing control inside those walls sent a message. Castillo's empire isn't unbreakable. Now his own men are nervous. His rivals are circling, and he's moving fast to secure his power." Boone's eyes traced the compound layout on the screen, absorbing entry points, security placements, vulnerabilities. "What's the window?" 48 hours, Graves said. "Castillo is hosting a private meeting with his top lieutenants, his inner circle. We're not just taking him out. We're eliminating the entire leadership structure in one move. The cartel doesn't get a chance to rebuild." Boone let that sit for a moment. This wasn't just about killing one man. This was burning the entire empire to the ground. Porter cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. "And Boone gets his freedom." Graves didn't hesitate. Not just freedom. Full slate wipe. A new name, a new life, off the grid. No loose ends. Boone knew better than to take that at face value. There were always loose ends. The difference was whether they were worth living with. Graves leaned back slightly. Dante Alvarez has already been transferred. He's in a medium security facility, far from cartel influence. He won't get out, but he'll stay breathing. Boone nodded once, letting that be enough. He had never expected Dante to walk free, but keeping him off the execution list was the best he could do. Graves clicked to the final slide. A tactical map with marked infiltration points and enemy positions will get you across the border. After that, you're on your own. No official backup, no reinforcements. You succeed, you disappear on our terms. You fail, no one comes looking. Boone smirked slightly. Business as usual. Graves clasped his hands together. Then let's get to work. Boone sat in the back of the unmarked jet, the low hum of the engines filling the cabin as they cut through the night sky. The interior was stripped down. All function and no luxury. No attendants, no wasted space. Just Boone, Graves, and two silent operators whose only job was to make sure he made it across the border in one piece. The air smelled like steel and stale coffee, and the only sound, aside from the engines, was the soft rustling of mission briefs and the occasional click of Graves's pen against the table. Boone wasn't reading the files anymore. He had already memorized every inch of Castillo's compound, every blind spot in the security cameras, every rotation pattern of the guards. He had studied the guest list, the schedules, even the layout of the panic room Castillo thought would keep him safe. None of that was what concerned him. Boone had fought ghosts in the dark before. The hard part wasn't getting in, it was getting out. Graves sat across from him, his suit as crisp as ever, completely at ease, like they were heading to a business meeting instead of a war. "You ready for this?" he asked, tapping a finger against the edge of the folder in front of him. Boone smirked, stretching his shoulders slightly. "Don't ask a man like me that unless you want the real answer." Graves exhaled through his nose, something close to amusement flickering in his otherwise unreadable expression. "Fair enough." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Once you hit the ground, you've got 6 hours before Castillo's security tightens. His lieutenants start arriving at sundown. That's your window." Boone nodded. "And exfil?" Graves glanced at the two operators sitting near the cockpit. One of them, a tall man with close-cropped hair and the kind of blank stare that belonged to career spooks, spoke for the first time. "There's a clearing 3 clicks east of the compound. We'll have a bird waiting. Get there by 0200. If you miss that window, you're on your own." Boone rolled his shoulders, checking the harness straps on his tactical vest. "Wouldn't be the first time." Graves slid a small black case across the table. Boone popped it open, scanning the contents. Custom Glock 19, suppressor, extra mags, and a sleek combat knife. Blackened steel, lightweight, the kind of blade meant for killing, not intimidation. A few other tools were tucked in the foam lining. Small explosives, lock picks, a burner phone already loaded with local frequencies. Boone picked up the knife first, testing the weight in his hand. He had never been a fan of carrying more than necessary. A gun could jam, a radio could fail, but a knife? A knife was personal. A knife didn't need reloading. Graves watched him, his expression unreadable. "You'll have a vehicle waiting on the outskirts of town, preloaded with gear, weapons, disguises, local intel. Once you reach the compound, you're on your own. No comms with us. You do the job, you exfil, and you disappear." Boone didn't respond. He just closed the case, locking everything into memory. Graves leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping an inch. "This is the last thing standing between you and freedom, Boone. No more prisons. No more running. You finish this, you walk away clean." Boone met his gaze, his smirk barely there, cold and knowing. No one walks away clean. The jet started its descent. Boone tightened the straps on his vest. Showtime. The jet touched down on a private airstrip just outside of Cancun. The landing smooth, controlled, precise. Boone barely felt the wheels hit the ground. The government didn't use commercial airports for jobs like this. Too many eyes, too many questions. Instead, they operated in the spaces between, using small runways owned by nameless shell companies, places where cargo moved without customs, where men disappeared without paperwork. By the time the jet taxied to a stop, Boone was already moving. He grabbed the black case from under his seat, securing the weapons inside his jacket and adjusting the tactical harness beneath his civilian clothes. He didn't look at Graves as he walked toward the exit. He didn't need to. They both knew what this was. The door opened, the thick heat of the Yucatan night rushing in. Boone stepped out, the sky above a deep, endless black, the air smelling of rain and gasoline. A single SUV waited at the edge of the tarmac, headlights cutting through the dark. A man leaned against the hood, smoking a cigarette, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Boone approached, his eyes sweeping the perimeter. No unnecessary movement, no lurking threats, just the quiet hum of insects in the jungle beyond. The man flicked his cigarette away as Boone stopped a few feet in front of him. He was older, late 50s maybe, with deep lines carved into his sun-weathered skin. His shirt was open at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal wiry, veined forearms. This was a man who had lived a hard life and survived it. "You Boone?" the man asked in Spanish, his voice rough from years of smoke and violence. Boone nodded once. The man studied him for a beat, then smirked. "You look like someone who doesn't belong here." Boone smirked right back. "I hear that a lot." The man chuckled, motioning toward the SUV. "Get in. We don't talk out here." Boone slid into the passenger seat without hesitation. The man climbed in behind the wheel, starting the engine with a smooth turn of the key. The moment they pulled onto the narrow jungle road, Boone glanced at him. "Who are you?" The man exhaled through his nose, shifting gears. "Call me Rojas. I'm your local handler. Graves sent me ahead to set everything up. Safe house, weapons, escape routes, whatever you need, I'll make it happen." Boone didn't bother with small talk. "Tell me about the compound." Rojas nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "Castillo's security has tightened since the Greystone fallout. He knows his enemies are watching, but he still thinks he's untouchable inside those walls. That's his weakness." Boone leaned back, listening. "There's a service road leading to the eastern wall, used mostly by suppliers and contractors. It's the quietest entry point, but they check vehicles hard. No easy way through the gate." Boone nodded. "What about the perimeter?" "Patrolled, but predictable. 2-man teams every 15 minutes. Dogs on the south side, motion sensors near the cliffs. But the jungle to the north? That's where the old drainage tunnels lead. They were used during construction, sealed up after, but not well enough." Boone's smirk was barely there. "That's my way in." Rojas chuckled. "I figured. I've got gear waiting at the safe house. Rope, charges, weapons. You'll have everything you need." Boone exhaled, rolling his shoulders. He had done jobs like this before, but this was different. This was personal. Rojas glanced at him. "You're not just here for Castillo, are you?" Boone's smirk was slow, sharp. "No." Rojas nodded, like he understood something deeper. "Then let's get you ready." The SUV sped into the night, the jungle closing in around them. The hunt had begun. The SUV rumbled down a dirt road, tires kicking up dust as it weaved through dense jungle, the headlights bouncing off thick palm leaves and gnarled roots stretching across the path. Rojas drove without hesitation, barely slowing for the rough terrain. He knew the route well. This wasn't the first time he had delivered a man to a fight. Boone sat in silence, scanning the darkness, committing every turn, every landmark to memory. He didn't trust GPS, didn't rely on technology. If things went sideways, he'd need to get out of here on foot. And he wasn't about to let some jungle maze trap him. After 20 minutes, the road opened up into a clearing, and there it was, the safe house. A 2-story concrete structure, unassuming but sturdy, built to blend in with the surrounding vegetation. The kind of place where no one asked questions, where men came to disappear or prepare for something violent. Rojas killed the engine. The night was thick with the sounds of insects and the distant hum of the ocean, but nothing else. No cars, no voices, no threats. Boone stepped out, stretching his shoulders, rolling his neck as he took in the perimeter. 2 exits, reinforced windows, a generator humming in the back. Good setup. Rojas unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cool, the scent of old wood and gun oil lingering. A single table sat in the center of the room, covered in gear: rifles, handguns, knives, explosives, enough firepower to start a war and finish one. Boone stepped forward, his eyes sweeping the selection. He ran a hand over a suppressed M4 carbine, light and compact, perfect for tight spaces. Beside it, a sleek, blacked-out Sig Sauer P226, the weight familiar in his palm. He checked the slide, the magazine, nodded to himself. "You'll want these," Rojas said, tossing a small duffel toward him. Boone caught it one-handed, unzipping it to find a tactical vest, extra magazines, and a few pounds of C4 neatly packed with remote triggers. Boone smirked. "Planning a fireworks show?" Rojas chuckled. "You want to kill a king? Make sure his throne burns with him." Boone strapped on the vest, securing the weapons, the explosives, making sure everything sat right against his body. He didn't need to carry much, just enough to do the job. Rojas leaned against the wall, watching him. "You do this right. Castillo's empire collapses overnight. You leave a power vacuum that'll tear itself apart before anyone can step up to replace him." Boone fastened the last buckle, rolling his shoulders. "That's the idea." Rojas exhaled, stepping closer, his voice lowering. "But once he's gone, you need to vanish. You stay too long, the cleanup crew won't be from your side." Boone already knew that. "I'll be out before the sun comes up." Rojas nodded, satisfied. "Then let's talk insertion." He led Boone to a map pinned to the wall. Aerial images of Castillo's compound, hand-drawn notes marking weak points, entry routes, and blind spots. North perimeter is your best bet. The old drainage tunnels run beneath the estate, sealed after construction, but not well enough. I had a guy check. Still accessible if you're willing to get dirty. Boone traced the path with his finger, mapping the approach in his mind. How far from the main house? 80 meters. You'll pop up near the garden terrace, close to the service entrance. Less security there. Castillo doesn't think anyone's getting in that way. Boone smirked. That's his first mistake. Rojas continued. "Once you're inside, you've got 30 minutes before the meeting starts. Castillo's lieutenants will be drinking, celebrating. They won't expect an attack. You take them out fast, you leave no survivors. Then you get to the exfil point. There's an old logging road 2 clicks east. No cameras, no checkpoints. I'll have a vehicle waiting." Boone nodded. "And if I miss the window?" Rojas gave a dry chuckle. "Then you better pray you run faster than bullets." Boone grabbed the rifle, slinging it over his shoulder, then pocketed extra ammunition. He was ready. Everything was set. Rojas clapped him on the back. "Time to go. The king doesn't know it yet, but his reign ends tonight." Boone adjusted his vest, feeling the weight settle against his chest. He had spent his life walking into fights that weren't supposed to be won, and he had walked out of every single one. Tonight would be no different. With one last breath, he stepped into the night, the jungle swallowing him whole. The hunt was on. Boone moved through the jungle like a shadow, his breath steady, each step measured, the compound ahead glowing against the thick wall of trees. Castillo's men patrolled in predictable rotations, their movements slow, unhurried. They had spent too long believing the walls around them made them safe. That belief was the opening Boone needed. Keeping low, he approached the north perimeter where Rojas had told him about the old drainage tunnels. Through the vines and overgrowth, the entrance was barely visible. A rusted grate left forgotten at the base of the hill. No cameras, no motion sensors. Just Castillo's overconfidence keeping it unguarded. Boone crouched, gripping the metal, testing its strength. It was weak, corroded from years of disuse. He slipped a crowbar from his vest, wedging it between the hinges and pressing forward. The metal groaned softly before giving way. He caught the grate before it could fall, lowering it into the dirt, then stilled. Above him, the quiet murmur of voices. 2 guards, speaking in low Spanish, the flick of a lighter breaking the silence. Boone waited, listening to their conversation shift toward something casual, something relaxed. He climbed up through the tunnel entrance, moving quickly through the shadows. The moment passed without disturbance. He adjusted the straps on his vest, glancing toward the garden terrace ahead. It led directly to the side entrance of the main house. From here, he could see the courtyard, the men stationed near the entrance, the grand staircase that led to the second floor where Castillo and his lieutenants were gathered. Music played softly from the open balcony doors. Glasses clinked together. Voices carried through the night. Sticking close to the wall, Boone slipped through a break in the security. His movements quick but unhurried. The side entrance was unguarded. Security focused on the front, where most of the activity was. He pressed against the door, listening, then turned the handle and stepped inside. The hallway stretched before him, lined with paintings, expensive vases, the kind of wealth meant to impress. A distant hum of conversation drifted from the main hall, but the corridor itself was empty. Boone moved quickly, boots soundless against the marble, passing doorways, listening for any sign of movement. Two men walked past an intersecting hallway, talking, their attention elsewhere. Boone stepped into a darkened alcove, waiting. The moment passed, unnoticed. He continued toward the staircase, his focus sharp, his breathing even. At the top, a set of double doors led to the main meeting room. Inside, Castillo and his inner circle were drinking, speaking in tones of certainty, unaware of the shift in their fate. Boone exhaled slowly. He had spent years fighting other people's battles. Tonight, he was ending his own. Boone took the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, the weight of the rifle steady in his grip. The thick wooden doors loomed ahead, muffling the voices inside. Castillo's lieutenants were drinking, laughing, oblivious. The air was charged, the tension building like the seconds before a storm. Boone moved to the side of the frame, pressing against the cool stone wall, exhaling slowly. His mind worked through the next few moments. The first few seconds were critical. Control the chaos, eliminate threats, make sure Castillo didn't have time to disappear behind bulletproof steel. The man would run. He wasn't the type to fight, not up close, not without an army between him and danger. Boone had no intention of giving him that chance. Reaching into his vest, he pulled out a compact concussive charge, no bigger than a deck of cards, not meant to kill, meant to disorient. He placed it just above the door handle, then stepped back, rolling his shoulders. He had done this before, in different places, under different circumstances, but the outcome was always the same. The countdown in his head hit 0. He pressed the detonator. The charge ignited with a sharp crack, the wooden doors blowing inward, dust and splinters kicking up as the room erupted in noise. Boone was through them before the smoke settled. Rifle up, eyes scanning. The first man closest to the door had just started to turn when Boone fired. One shot, clean. The second man fumbled for his weapon, knocked off balance by the explosion. Boone put 2 rounds in his chest before he could pull the trigger. The room plunged into chaos. Castillo's lieutenants scrambled, chairs scraping against the floor, glasses toppling, shouts of confusion turning into curses. A few went for weapons. Boone moved fast. Another shot, another body slamming into the dining table, knocking over a half-empty bottle of whiskey. Across the room, Castillo was still seated, his hand gripping the edge of the table. His eyes were sharp, calculating. He hadn't moved yet. He was watching, measuring. Boone could see the gears turning in his head, the slow realization that this wasn't some botched security breach. This was personal. Boone stepped forward, slow, controlled, the muzzle of his rifle sweeping across the room, keeping the remaining men frozen in place. He could feel the shift, the weight of inevitability settling over them. Castillo exhaled through his nose, adjusting his cuff, forcing a smirk onto his face. I have to admit, I didn't see this coming. Boone didn't respond. He took another step forward, his boots crunching against broken glass. Castillo leaned back in his chair, studying him. They told me you died in gray stone. Boone kept the rifle steady. They should have tried harder. The smirk on Castillo's face didn't waver, but Boone saw the way his fingers twitched against the wood of the table, the way his gaze flickered toward the reinforced steel door on the far end of the room. The panic room. His only escape. Boone moved first. A sudden burst of movement from his left. One of Castillo's men, reaching for a pistol under his jacket. Boone fired before the man could even clear the holster. A sharp, muffled crack, and the body crumpled. Another chair scraped against the floor. Someone else shifting, preparing for a desperate move. "Don't!" Boone warned, his voice flat. The man hesitated, then sat back slowly, hands raised. Castillo exhaled, glancing at the body slumped near his feet. Then back at Boone. "You think killing me changes anything?" Boone tilted his head slightly. "I think it ends a lot of things." Castillo chuckled, shaking his head. "There's always another man. Always someone waiting for the throne." Boone took another step forward. "Not this time." Castillo studied him for a long moment. "You really believe that?" Boone didn't answer. Castillo exhaled, his smirk fading, his fingers flexing slightly against the armrest. Then, without warning, he moved, shoving the chair back, pushing himself up, lunging toward the panic room controls. Boone reacted instantly. He surged forward, slamming into Castillo before the man could reach the biometric lock, yanking him back and driving him into the wall. Castillo grunted, twisting, trying to break free, but Boone was stronger. He pinned him, forearm pressed hard against his chest, keeping him trapped. Castillo's breath was ragged, but the glint in his eyes was still there. Defiant. "You won't make it out of here," he muttered. Boone leaned in slightly. "Neither will you." Castillo's smirk returned, a fraction of what it had been. "You think I'm afraid to die?" Boone didn't blink. "No, but I think you're afraid of what comes after." The first flicker of doubt crossed Castillo's face, so subtle most wouldn't notice. But Boone did. For the first time, Rodrigo Castillo knew he had lost. Boone let the silence stretch, then pulled him away from the wall, keeping his grip firm. The fight had left Castillo's body, but his mind was still racing, still searching for some way out. Boone wasn't going to give him one. He turned him toward the wreckage of his empire, toward the bodies of the men who had protected him, the remnants of a kingdom built on the illusion of power. "This is how it ends," Boone said quietly. Castillo's jaw tightened, his shoulders tensing. Boone didn't hesitate. One swift movement, one final shot. Castillo's body slumped forward, hitting the ground with a dull thud. The weight of the moment settled over the room. The empire was finished. Boone exhaled slowly, stepping over the wreckage, already moving. The compound would respond soon. Someone would come looking. His window was closing. Time to disappear. Boone moved fast, stepping over the wreckage of Castillo's empire, his pulse steady even as the weight of what he'd just done settled around him. The smell of gunpowder and spilled whiskey hung thick in the air, mixing with the distant echoes of alarms now blaring through the compound. The guards outside would be scrambling, confused, some likely hesitating to act without orders. That hesitation wouldn't last long. Boone had minutes, maybe less, before the full force of Castillo's security came down on the estate like a hammer. He crossed the room, his boots crunching over broken glass, slipping a fresh magazine into his rifle as he approached the balcony doors. The compound stretched below, its manicured gardens now a maze of moving shadows as men rushed toward the main house, their radios crackling with frantic orders. They knew something had gone wrong. They just didn't know how bad. Boone kept moving, stepping out onto the terrace, scanning for the quickest escape route. The grand staircase leading down to the courtyard was a no-go. Too exposed. Too many eyes. The perimeter walls were high, but the jungle beyond them was thick, offering cover if he could get past the guards before they locked the place down. Then, movement. Two figures rushing toward the staircase inside the house, their boots heavy against the marble floor. Boone pressed himself against the side of the doorway, adjusting his grip on his rifle. He didn't want a prolonged fight. He needed out now. The first man burst through the doorway, weapon raised, sweeping the room. Boone moved first, striking hard and fast, his rifle butt connecting with the man's jaw, sending him staggering sideways. The second barely had time to react before Boone drove a sharp elbow into his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. He grabbed the man's vest, yanked him forward, then spun him around, using his body as a shield as the first guard recovered, gun raised. A hesitation. That's all Boone needed. He shoved the second man into the first, their bodies tangling just long enough for Boone to break away, sprinting toward the edge of the terrace. He vaulted over the railing, landing hard in the soft dirt below, rolling with the impact before springing to his feet. Gunfire erupted behind him. Bullets snapped past, tearing into the garden walls as he zigzagged through the foliage, keeping his movements unpredictable. Shouts filled the air. Orders barked in Spanish. The sound of more men rushing toward the chaos. The compound was waking up. Boone pushed harder, weaving through the hedges, his breathing controlled. His exit plan was clear. Head east, slip past the patrols, reach the logging road where Rojas had stashed the vehicle. If he could make it there before the guards mobilized a full perimeter lockdown, he'd be gone before they even knew which direction to search. The walls loomed ahead, a 10-foot stretch of reinforced stone topped with razor wire. A guard tower sat to the left. But the spotlight wasn't fixed on this section. Another oversight, another weakness Castillo had never thought to address. Boone didn't slow. He ran full tilt, boots pounding against the dirt as he leapt, catching the edge of the wall with both hands. He hauled himself up fast, muscles burning from the exertion, his fingers barely avoiding the cruel bite of the wire. He swung a leg over, dropped to the other side, landing in the tall grass just beyond the compound's border. The jungle wrapped around him instantly. Thick, dark, safe. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders, then started moving again, cutting through the undergrowth, pushing toward the extraction point. Behind him, the compound was a mess of shouts and alarms, the confusion still spreading. By the time they realized Castillo was gone, Boone would already be miles away. He pressed forward, each step taking him closer to the road, to the waiting vehicle, to the next phase of whatever life was waiting for him beyond this night. He had done what he came to do. The empire was finished. Now, he just had to make sure he didn't get buried with it. Boone moved through the jungle with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime slipping into and out of places he wasn't supposed to be. The dense foliage swallowed him whole, the sounds of the compound fading behind him, replaced by the hum of insects and the distant call of nocturnal creatures. His boots pressed into damp earth, his breathing steady, the rifle still warm in his hands. He wasn't out yet. Not until he was behind the wheel of that vehicle and on a road that led anywhere but here. The logging road wasn't far now, just another half-mile through thick underbrush. He kept his pace controlled. Not running, not rushing. Running made noise. Running made mistakes. The jungle was a living thing, and it would betray the reckless. A distant crack of a branch. Not an animal. Boone didn't stop moving, but his grip tightened on the rifle. Someone was following. He shifted course slightly, adjusting his angle toward a small incline that overlooked the road. If they were tracking him, they'd be expecting him to keep moving in a straight line. He wasn't about to give them that. He pressed low against the damp earth, listening, counting his breaths. Another sound. Closer. Boone turned his head just enough to catch movement through the trees. A single figure, moving cautiously. Weapon raised. The man wasn't rushing. He was hunting. Boone exhaled, centering himself. The problem with being hunted was that most men never realized when the roles had reversed. He let the tracker move closer, let him commit to the approach. The man was good, quiet, controlled, taking his time. Boone respected that, but not enough to let him walk away. He moved fast, a sharp pivot in the dirt, rising just as the man passed his position. A clean strike, his arm locking around the guy's throat before he had time to react. A struggle, a desperate gasp, then silence. Boone eased the man to the ground, checking for identifiers. No cartel insignia, no standard issue gear. This wasn't one of Castillo's men. Government. Boone checked the body for radios, weapons, standard issue handgun, A combat knife, a tactical vest loaded with spare ammo. He exhaled slowly. Realization settling in. This wasn't cleanup from the compound. This was something else entirely. They weren't just letting him go. They were watching. Boone pressed a hand to his ribs, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath, keeping his focus. Whatever game they were playing, it didn't change the objective. Get to the vehicle. Get clear. He moved again, cutting through the jungle, keeping his steps deliberate, his mind working through the implications. If the government had men in the area, that meant Graves had been expecting him to need a push, maybe even expecting him to fail. That wasn't going to happen. The trees thinned, and there it was, the road. Rojas's SUV sat where it was supposed to. Engine off. No sign of movement inside. Boone slowed, scanning the tree line, the slope behind the vehicle. No movement. He moved forward, one careful step at a time. Weapon still raised. He reached the driver's side, gripping the handle, ready to swing in and punch the gas. Then he saw the reflection in the side mirror. Rojas, standing a few feet behind him, hands in his pockets. Boone didn't turn immediately, keeping his posture loose, controlled. I was expecting something a little smoother. Rojas let out a low chuckle. You made it, didn't you? Boone turned, scanning the man's expression, searching for anything that felt off. Rojas looked calm, casual, like he had been waiting for Boone to show up with no doubt in his mind about the outcome. You knew they'd be watching, Boone said. Rojas shrugged. They don't just let men like you walk away, Boone. They like insurance. Boone exhaled through his nose. That what you are? Rojas smirked. I'm the guy making sure you get out of here in one piece. He nodded toward the road. You're clear. No more tails, no checkpoints. Drive south, cross the border, and disappear. Boone didn't move yet. And then what? Rojas's smirk faded slightly. Then you stop looking over your shoulder. They're done with you. Castillo's dead. The cartel's eating itself alive, and no one left breathing is asking for revenge. He met Boone's gaze. This is as close to peace as you're ever going to get. Boone let that settle. For years, his life had been dictated by missions, by orders, by wars he hadn't started, but had always found himself finishing. Even in Greystone, the fight had never really stopped. But now, there was nothing left to fight. No enemies waiting in the dark, no debts to be repaid, just an open road and the promise of a life that belonged only to him. Boone gave a slow nod, then turned, pulling the driver's side door open. He slid in, gripping the wheel, feeling the cool leather beneath his fingers. The engine rumbled to life, low and steady. Rojas stepped back, giving him space. Don't get yourself killed, Boone. Boone smirked, shifting the SUV into drive. No promises. Then he hit the gas, the jungle fading behind him, the road stretching into the unknown. The road carried Boone south, far beyond the reach of men who had once dictated his fate. The highway gave way to smaller roads, winding through quiet stretches of jungle, then past dusty villages where street lights flickered dimly, where people moved in slow, easy rhythms, unconcerned with the weight of the world beyond their borders. He kept driving, letting the night pull him deeper into the unknown, until at last the city lights faded behind him, and the coastline stretched wide and endless ahead. The house was small, tucked away near the cliffs, where the ocean met the rocks in a steady, unbroken rhythm. It wasn't the kind of place someone like him was supposed to end up. But then again, life had never taken him where he was supposed to go. Rojas had set it up. Clean paperwork, a name that wasn't his but belonged to him now. A property that would never be traced back to anything that mattered. A place to disappear. Boone parked the SUV, stepping out into the thick, salty air. The world felt different here. Slower, quieter. The tension that had gripped his muscles for years finally beginning to loosen. He grabbed the duffel from the passenger seat, slinging it over his shoulder as he walked toward the door. It was unlocked. No need for security out here. No one was looking for him anymore. Inside, the space was simple. Wood-paneled walls, an old ceiling fan turning lazily overhead, the scent of salt and aged furniture lingering in the air. A small kitchen, a worn leather couch, a bedroom with a window facing the sea. Boone dropped his bag near the door, walking through the space like a man feeling the edges of something unfamiliar, something fragile. He poured a drink, dark and strong, and stepped onto the small balcony overlooking the water. The ocean stretched forever, the waves rolling in a slow, steady rhythm. Unbothered by the chaos of men, he took a sip, the warmth of the alcohol settling in his chest, and let his mind drift back through the years. 15 years in the Navy. A life spent on the edge of war, moving through places most men only read about in headlines. He had been good at it, maybe too good. The missions, the clear objectives, the moments where survival had been the only currency that mattered. But the war didn't end when the job did. It followed men home, lived in their bones, waiting in the silence between assignments. That was why he had taken the private jobs, the security work, the assignments that let him keep moving, keep fighting. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. Then came the cartel job. Routine, simple, until it wasn't. Boone had spent his life eliminating threats, but he had never expected to become one. Castillo had made sure of that. The setup had been perfect. Fake evidence, paid witnesses, a trial that had been decided before it even started. Greystone had been the final move, a death sentence, slow and inevitable. But Boone had never been the kind of man to die in a cell. The fights, the alliances, the slow war waged in the shadows of that prison. He had learned to count time differently in Greystone, not in days, but in battles. Every night he survived was another move on the board. Another piece shifting in a game designed to break men, but he hadn't broken. And when the time came, when the opportunity presented itself, he had taken it. The men who had pulled him out hadn't done it out of kindness. They had wanted something, and Boone had given it to them. Castillo was dead. The empire was gone, and Boone had walked away, free. He let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders, letting the weight of it all settle. He had spent so many years surviving that he had never stopped to consider what came after. The government had given him this place, this new name, this clean slate. No debts, no chases, no unfinished business. For the first time in his life, Boone had no war left to fight. He took another sip of his drink, the burn settling in his chest, and let his gaze drift over the endless stretch of water. The waves didn't care about the things he had done. They didn't care about the men he had been before, the choices he had made, the blood on his hands. The ocean just existed, steady and unchanging. Maybe it was time for Boone to learn how to do the same. He leaned back against the railing, the wind carrying the scent of salt and freedom, and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to do. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.